good evening. My name is Lucy. I'm the president of the University of Toronto Students for Life Club. On behalf of UTSFL and NCLN, I'm happy to welcome you all to the debate entitled Abortion, Human Right or Human Rights Violation. Just so you guys know, we are filming this event, so you might appear on a YouTube video in a week or something. If that's a problem, just sit further back, I guess. So tonight, we're very happy to welcome our debaters. Arguing that abortion is a human right, we have Dr. Donald AInslie. Donald AInslie is the chair of the Department of Philosophy in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and also the chair of the Tri-Campus Graduate Department of Philosophy. Early this year, he was named president of University College. He received his Bachelor of Science studying mathematics at Queen's University and his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. AInslie's research interests include philosophy of David Hume, naturalism and ethics, and the foundation of bioethics. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. AInslie. Arguing for abortion as a human rights violation, we have Stephanie Gray. Stephanie Gray is the co-founder and executive director of the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. She's been involved in debates and various pro-life presentations at post-secondary schools and other forms of institutions. She was the president of Lifeline, the pro-life club at UBC, and has been involved in GAP presentations. Stephanie's been interviewed on multiple radio shows and has been a guest on television programs such as CTV, VTV, and ATV News. Stephanie holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of British Columbia and a certification in Healthcare Ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us tonight, Stephanie. And tonight, moderating the debate, we have Brent Schmidt. Brent is the training director for the UN Society and an award-winning delegate. He moderates and debates regularly at the Hart House Debate Society. He's studying political science and history at UofT. Thank you for joining us, Brent.
All right, thank you everyone. So my name is Brent. I'm going to be your moderator for tonight. I'm just going to go really quickly over how the debates are going to work so you guys know what's going on. So the way this is going to work is we're going to start it with two opening statements. We're going to start it with Stephanie Gray. She's going to give a 20-minute speech, followed by a 20-minute speech from Donald AInslie. After that, we will be having two sessions of rebuttal, 10-minute first by Stephanie Gray, and then another 10 minutes by Donald AInslie. That will fall. After those, there will be following some closing statements, each of 5 minutes by the debaters. So there will be a basically about a half an hour questions and answers after the session. So basically during the debate, I'd ask that everyone remain respectful because you'll get your chance to share your righteous indignation or anything like that when the questions period does come. I do ask that when we do ask questions, I'll remind you, you seem like a lovely crowd, but try to remain respectful. People can't give up their time, so it'd be cool if everyone could just keep a civil atmosphere. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Stephanie Gray to give the first 20-minute opening statement. Thank you.
I'll wait for you to give me the go-ahead. Not too long ago in Calgary, there was an advertisement by the Canadian Down Syndrome Society, and they had a series of ads running not only in Alberta and in other provinces. And I was struck by the beauty of this ad, which said, "Celebrate being." And of course, pictured in this advertisement or message is an image of a young girl who has Down syndrome. The message that I take from this campaign is that even though one human to another may differ in appearance and may differ in ability, what we're all united in is our common human nature. We are, after all, human beings, not human doings. And that, the Down Syndrome Society is at least telling us, is something to be celebrated. Perhaps you may or may not be aware that in Canada, over 90% of positive Down syndrome diagnoses from prenatal testing end in abortion. Over 90%. Now, can you imagine our society permitting the killing of this young girl because she has Down syndrome? I cannot. And yet, if she were a little bit younger in utero, our society en masse would not only permit the killing of this young girl through abortion, but it would be paid for by our tax dollars. The question we're asked this evening to consider is abortion moral or immoral? Is it a human right or a human rights violation? The position I'm taking is that abortion is an immoral act. You can consider, first of all, that we as a society recognize that it is wrong to directly and intentionally kill an innocent human being. The case I'll be making this evening is that abortion directly and intentionally kills innocent human beings. So therefore, the conclusion will be that abortion is wrong. So what I'm going to be focusing my presentation on is the proof of that second statement. I'm going to be beginning my arguments by making the case for the humanity of the preborn, and the second half of my opening remarks will be making the case for how abortion is an act of violence which kills these human preborn children. So first of all, in terms of whether the preborn are human and when life begins, I'd like to address that first. If you ask yourself, for example, when life begins, the scientific community has come to a consensus on that in sexual reproduction, we begin our lives at fertilization. We know, for example, at fertilization that if you have human parents, what comes into existence is of the same species, so you will have human offspring. We also know that that zygote, the technical term given to the newly conceived being, that zygote is alive. And we know that because of the basic scientific principle which says living things come from other living things. Now, having said that, some people may point out, well, if living things come from other living things and you're claiming the zygote is alive, all that means is that the sperm and the egg from which the zygote came are also alive. So some people may wonder, am I claiming that sperms are equal to zygotes or eggs are equal to zygotes? And so the third point is very important about fertilization and the science of fertilization. And that is, at fertilization, that zygote is a human whole, a whole being, as opposed to the sperm being human sperm, but a human part. Or the egg being a human egg as opposed to a dog egg, but a part of a human, not a whole human. The zygote, on the contrary, is a whole being who has everything she needs within herself to move to the next, more mature stage of human development. If an egg is by itself in the uterus, it won't move through the stages of human development, whereas the embryo does move through the stage to the fetal stage, the infancy stage, toddler stage, teenager stage, and ultimately the stage of adulthood. We know that at fertilization, the zygote is substantively different from the human parts we had prior to fertilization, the sperm and the egg. And we know that by looking at how the scientific community distinguishes different cell types. When they want to say, well, how is this cell different from that cell? They look at what the cell is made up of, and they look at what the cell does. And it's by looking at these two things that we can determine a brand new entity comes into existence, literally in the instant of sperm-egg fusion, which is the beginning of the process of fertilization. And if you look at the composition of the sperm, it has the genetic material from the father. The composition of the egg, the genetic material from the mother. But the composition of the zygote, its sperm-egg fusion, is the genetic material of both the mother and the father. Even prior to the chromosomes intermingling, nonetheless what is contained is different from that of the sperm and egg by themselves. The behavior of that cell is also different. The sperm's behavior is to find an egg and penetrate it. The egg's behavior is to sit and allow for penetration. But once one sperm has fertilized an egg, once you have sperm-egg fusion, that zygote acts, it behaves to prevent penetration. So its behavior is different. So we know that we are dealing with a brand new entity at fertilization. And from that point forward, what changes is what that entity looks like and what that entity is able to do, but the very nature of that being and who he or she is remains constant, even as these other things change over time. The idea that life begins at fertilization is backed up in embryology textbooks. For example, this one authored by Moore and Prasad, who have authored many embryology textbooks. The Developing Human is one of them. Also, this textbook, The Essentials of Human Embryology, very clearly tells us that life begins at fertilization. Now, what's happening in the abortion debate is some people may divorce the concept of human from person, treat them as two separate entities, and may concede that my science is correct about the humanity of the preborn, but may deny the preborn their personhood status, arguing that from fertilization to birth, there are some significant changes or differences. And it's because the preborn differ from an infant in certain ways that a preborn, while human, is not a person, whereas an infant is a person. So let's look at these differences to see if our right to life or our personhood should be based on them. Some people deny the preborn their personhood status because they're smaller. Others will argue that the preborn are less developed. They may say, well, they're not rational, or they don't have consciousness, or they can't feel pain, or they can't communicate in complex languages. They're less developed from us. They're not people. Others may argue that because they're in their mother's body, they're not people. Or they may say because they need the mother's body for survival, they're not persons. Now, I will admit that all of these differences exist. My question is, why do they matter when it comes to our right to life? After all, look at the period of time between birth and someone who's an adult, and ask yourself over, let's say, a 20-year period, what's changed? What's changed are those same four things. An infant is smaller than a 20-year-old. The intellectual abilities of an infant compared to a 20-year-old are very immature. The environment of individuals after birth is constantly changing, and how much we need our parents is generally very high when we're infants, and as we get to our 20s, it's lower, although some parents may say their 20 and 30-year-olds at home are rather dependent. I bring this up, however, to make the point that I don't think we as a reasonable society would claim that an infant or a toddler or a 5-year-old is not a person and does not have a right to life because they're less developed or more dependent than you and me. Why then would our society say the embryo or the fetus is not a person simply because they're less developed or more dependent than that 5-year-old or that 2-year-old or that infant? What is consistent over this 20-year and 9-month time period is that we're dealing with a genetically distinct, whole, living human being. If you ask yourself, why are the preborn smaller than us? Why is an infant less developed intellectually compared to an adult? And the answer is, for those who are younger, less time has passed and they haven't had time to develop themselves, and time is typically reflected in our age. They're smaller because they're younger. They're less developed because they're younger. They need their mother's bodies because of how old they are. When you're that age in our species, you need to be in your mother's womb. Why should those of us who are older have a right to kill those who are younger? In the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it says the following: recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It goes on to say in Article 3, everyone has a right to life. Now, who's everyone? Members of the human family. Well, the preborn, we know scientifically, are members of the human family. Therefore, they have a right to life. It's interesting to note that this document by the United Nations came out in 1948 on the heels of the Holocaust, where human beings were denied their personhood status because they differed from other human beings in some way: their religion, their race, their ethnicity. They were clearly human, but those in power said, well, they're not people. And so what we can learn from this is that while human is an objective term, a scientific term rather, that we can determine objectively, person, as I'm going to show with more examples than this, is a philosophical and legal term that has had a changing definition throughout history. It was once defined by your race or your religion. There was also a time where personhood was defined by your sex. And if you were a woman, you were not a person. Then there was another period in human history where personhood was defined by your ethnicity. And if you were Native American, you weren't a person. Then there was another period in history where personhood was defined by the color of your skin. And if you were African American, you weren't deemed to be a person in the United States. And now we have the situation in Canada where personhood is defined by age. The preborn are denied their personhood status simply because they're younger than us. Now, speaking of age, I happened to ask my young niece at the age of 2.5 what she thought a person was. And I'd like to play for you her reply.
Hey, Monica, what's a person?
No matter a person is a person, no matter how small.
Who wants to dance?
Mommy tells me the person hears who?
That's right. Are you a person?
No.
Are girls not people? Well, then who's a person?
You.
Well, according to the logic of my niece, if I am a person, but girls are not people, then I'm not a girl. I also happened to ask that question, what is a person, to a group of grade 7 students. And this one boy in the back instantly raised his hand and he says, a person is someone with 2 arms and 2 legs. Really, I said, because I know of this motivational speaker from Australia by the name of Nick Vujicic who doesn't have arms and legs. Is he a person, I asked these students. Yes, they all agreed. Well, then I said, that can't be our definition of a person. What's a person? Well, this other student in the class raised his hand. He said, a person is someone with feelings, someone who can feel things. I said, well, this little girl by the name of Gabby Gingras has a very rare condition where she can't feel pain. Is she not a person because she can't feel pain? And they all said, no, she's obviously a person. Well, then what's a person, I said. This other student in the class raised her hand, and she said, well, a person is someone who can think and someone who can talk. Really, I said, because when my little nephew Francis was born, he couldn't think or talk, and even now, can't really talk. Now, does that mean he's not a person or wasn't a person then? No, they all said he's a person. Well, what's a person? Now, I noticed this girl off sort of in the corner of the room was like waving her arm, trying to get my attention, and it was making her wait for a bit, and then finally I thought, okay, I'll oblige. So I said, yes, I said, how would you define a person? And she says, with a lot of exasperation, look, it's really easy to figure out if someone is of the species Homo sapiens. And if they are, then they're a person. I asked this grade 7 girl if I could take her to university. But indeed, the one thing we have in common is our human nature. If we acknowledge our right to life by virtue as existing, everyone's safe. But if we claim someone's right to life is to be granted based on some feature or ability, inevitably someone gets left out. Whether it's someone without arms and legs, infants because they can't think, someone who can't feel pain, or someone like the preborn, who are our offspring, but just happen to be a little smaller, less developed, in a different place, and more dependent than you and me. It is undeniable that the preborn are human. The question is abortion an action which directly and intentionally kills these humans? The position I'm obviously taking tonight in considering abortion an immoral act is that yes, the evidence clearly shows us that abortion directly and intentionally kills these innocent human beings. In making the claim that abortion kills and is wrong, I'd like to point out that in condemning the action of abortion, I am not condemning the actors who have been involved with abortion. I have friends who have had abortions, and while I condemn what they did, I do not condemn who they are as people. I recognize that we all make mistakes. And quite frankly, even if someone hasn't had an abortion, perhaps that person is still guilty of abortion because even if we don't commit it, we often permit it through silence and through indifference. But I would like to take this opportunity to say that I firmly believe whatever we have or haven't done insofar as contributing to abortion, that there is hope and there is forgiveness and there are programs to help people who regret that decision. In fact, there's a program here in Ontario called Second Chance Ministries to help women and men who regret their abortion decisions. So does abortion kill? I'm going to put up a couple slides from Nucleus Medical Art, which is not a pro-life organization. It's a leading creator and distributor of medical illustrations, medical animations, and they have online imagery of abortion, warning you that this is graphic. This is a dilation and evacuation procedure which is legal in Canada, which is paid for by our tax dollars. I recently debated a late-term abortionist at the University of Western Ontario's medical school just in January who saw this image, who does these abortions, and said, yes, it looks just like that. This image clearly shows us that abortion dismembers, decapitates, and disembowels the body of a human being. Even early in pregnancy, in the first trimester, when majority of abortions are performed, while the preborn child is smaller, we already know we're dealing with a human being, and we're dealing with an action which, again, pulls the body apart in pieces, often through the power of a suction tube. What I'm going to do now is play some video footage of abortion, warning you that it's even more graphic than what you just saw. My colleague Greg Cunningham has said there is a difference between blood shed to heal and blood shed to kill. And the question for all of us to consider this evening is that, is this shedding of blood done to heal or to kill? I'd like to read from an abortion advocate, Naomi Wolf, who wrote about the use of imagery, abortion imagery amongst pro-lifers, she herself being someone who supports abortion. And she says the pro-choice movement often treats with contempt the pro-lifers' practice of holding up to our faces their disturbing graphics. But how can we charge that it is vile and repulsive for pro-lifers to brandish vile and repulsive images if the images are real? To insist that the truth is in poor taste is the very height of hypocrisy. She goes on to say, if these images are often the facts of the matter, and if we then claim it is offensive for pro-choice women to be confronted by them, then we are making the judgment that women are too inherently weak to face a truth about which they have to make a grave decision. This view of women, she says, is unworthy of feminism. I would say another view that is unworthy of feminism is the idea that we women need to have access to killing our children to be considered equal with men. The idea that we women need to kill our children to deal with difficult life circumstances. And I certainly don't doubt the difficult life circumstances a woman facing an unplanned pregnancy may be in. Maybe she conceived as a result of rape. Maybe she's poor. Maybe she has no family support. But if we go back to this timeline and we ask ourselves, would we ever allow anyone to kill the infant, toddler, or adult pictured here because their father was a rapist? Because their mother was poor or had no family support? We wouldn't. Neither should we allow those difficult life circumstances be grounds to kill the preborn child, because we know scientifically they are human like the born. The evidence has been provided this evening for how life begins at fertilization, how the preborn are human beings like you and me. We looked at things like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights to realize if we're members of the human family, we have a right to life. The evidence is that abortion denies these human beings their right to life, and so I come to the conclusion that abortion is immoral. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Stephanie Gray for her opening statement and now call upon Donald AInslie for his first 20-minute statement. Thank you.
All right, how's that? You got that? Yeah. Okay. Ready to go? Okay. A couple of differences, just to start us off. Stephanie is a very impressive debater, very hard act to follow. She's also someone who has graphics that I don't. So I'm just going to talk at you for a while and give some of my thoughts. Something else, I'm a man, obviously. She's a woman. She can get pregnant, or I assume she can. I haven't asked. I can't. Something else, I'm a gay man at that. So I don't exactly have a big stake in the abortion debate personally, although I think there are deep moral issues at stake, as Stephanie herself said near the end of her presentation. My research as a philosophy professor, I work in different areas, but one of the areas I work in is bioethics, and I'm particularly interested in what I call the bioethics of everyday life. That is to say, exploring the moral issues that arise for each of us insofar as we're human beings, where human beings are the kind of nature we have, where we come into the world through being carried by our mothers for 9 months, the product of sexual reproduction, and so on. So I teach the abortion debate in a class, Philosophy 281, Bioethics. Some of you might have taken it, I don't know. And what I do there is not so much think of the legal question about whether abortion is a right or not, though I raise that at a different part of the course, but I'm more interested in the moral question as to what each of us should think of it as we try and make sense of our existence as human beings. And I think it's really important to separate the legal issue from the moral issue. So there are lots of things that are immoral that aren't and shouldn't be illegal. So being a jerk, for example. Someone, you kind of think, what an idiot, that's kind of a reprehensible way to live, but we're not in the business of passing laws against jerks. And there are lots of things that are illegal that aren't and shouldn't be immoral. So beyond the fact that you're breaking the law and doing it, something like jaywalking. Okay, pretty innocuous. Ultimately, there are good reasons it's against the law, but it's not particularly immoral to do it. My point is that you need a very different kind of argument to discuss what the law should be than to discuss what morality requires. And in particular, in a pluralistic society like ours, where we have deep differences about questions of morality, questions of religion, and so on, it's not for any of us to simply move from our considered moral opinions about a complex situation and then say, well, that's what the law should say. Instead, we have to have laws that are fair to people who disagree on all sorts of questions having to do with morality. In Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which does that by protecting the right to liberty, the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and so on. So I'm going to talk not about the legal question of abortion, but about the moral question of abortion. So it's not going to be really about abortion being a human right, because I don't think rights properly belong in the discussion, because I think rights are a concept that ultimately belong in a legal context. Rights are things that should be enforced by the state. There is a question about rights in the offing here, but that's not the one I'm going to talk about. And I think one of the problems about the abortion debate is that people end up using language that doesn't actually capture the complexity of the situation. I think there's a problem with right talks, particularly the idea that the fetus has a right to life from the moment of conception, as Stephanie has suggested, that somehow I think fails to get things as complicated as they really are. Rights are blunt moral instruments, and morality is more complicated than that. I'll talk about the moment of conception in a little bit, because I think that's a little more complicated as well. But one way to look at the way in which the way of talking about abortion in terms of rights sometimes gets things oversimplified is that you actually do polls of people, and you ask them, do you believe in the right to life? You'll get people saying yes. Then you'll ask the question, should women be allowed to have an abortion when their life is under threat? And people who say they believe in the right to life say yes, very often, like 90% of them. And that's kind of inconsistent, because Suppose somehow, in order to stay alive, I had to kill Stephanie, or Stephanie had to be killed. That doesn't give anybody the right to kill her. So if you thought that the fetus had a right to life, then saying then that it's okay for the abortion to happen to protect the woman's life, that's inconsistent. Certainly lots of people who say they're in favor of the right to life also say they're in favor of abortion in cases of rape or incest. Again, that's, as Stephanie herself pointed out, that's inconsistent. If you think that there's a right to life in the strong sense that people who oppose abortion, like Stephanie, sometimes say, that it absolutely makes no sense to say that someone who's raped should be permitted to have an abortion. But lots of people do think that. And I think they think that actually for good reasons. But I'm going to talk about, I'm going to hold off on that for a second, because I want to say that the flip side of the argument often also makes a mistake. Some people who support the legal right to abortion think thereby that they have to say that abortion is a morally innocuous notion, that getting an abortion is a trivial matter, like getting a haircut, as it famously says in one philosophy article. But I think that that's wrong too. Lots of us think that some abortions are morally repugnant. So abortion at, say, 8 months because you want to take a trip to Europe, I think that's morally repugnant. So what I'm trying to say is that the moral language that typically gets used in the abortion debate doesn't really do justice to the complexity of the issue. It doesn't generally do a very good job of addressing the questions that spring from our biological nature. We're used to thinking about morality about rational individuals. But as biological creatures who reproduce sexually the way we do, that element of our nature doesn't get forefronted in our moral discussion. We have to keep in mind what we know, namely that we start our lives in our mother's wombs, and after 9 months we are born as very dependent human infants. And unless you want to support infanticide, and I don't, killing an infant is morally wrong. Completely agree with Stephanie on that. And unless you oppose all forms of birth control, and I don't, stopping a pregnancy from occurring is morally innocuous. So sometime between the beginning and the end of pregnancy, a fetus reaches a stage where it's morally significant enough that it has the same kind of moral standing as you or me, and killing it is wrong. The extreme views say it's wrong from the very start, from conception, or it's wrong, or it's not wrong until the very end of that period, when the infant is born. And I think both of those views don't quite fit the moral reality that confronts us when we think about the beginning of life. So I want to remind you about some basic biology, and in a way I'm going to be returning to some of what Stephanie was talking about. We're the products, almost all of us, of sexual reproduction. With IVF it's not necessarily true, but probably most of us, probably all of us, products of sexual reproduction. One thing to keep in mind is that Stephanie had this nice line where there was the zygote, the fertilized egg, and then at the other end was the 20-year-old woman. But there are lots of stopping points there because 30 to 60% of zygotes fail to implant. So there's fails even for there to be a pregnancy that really gets started, and often the woman in question won't even know. In fact, in most cases, won't even know that she's had a fertilized egg there. She might have a slightly heavy period, maybe not. So she wouldn't even know that there was a fertilized egg here. Of those eggs that do implant, so about 40 to 50%, 25% of those spontaneously miscarry within 6 weeks. And again, many women who are pregnant in that sense won't know. They'll just have a late period and a heavy period. They won't even know that there ever was a fertilized egg in play. Think about that. No more than 40% of fertilized eggs actually yield a pregnancy that's recognized by the woman in question. Now think about that if we think that the relevant moral starting point is fertilization. So 60% of those fertilized eggs we don't even know about. But if the death of a fertilized egg, if you want to call it a death, if that's morally the same as the death of you or me, we'd have to really radically change our practices, right? When a woman had a period, if she was sexually active, she should worry that in her menses is someone with the moral standing that you or I have. That'll be a bear, ladies. What would that be like for the, when you have your period? It's not really what you want to be doing, but that's what would be morally required of you if a fertilized egg was the relevant moment. Right? Because we wouldn't want to simply, flush it down the toilet or throw it away. You'd want to have a proper acknowledgement of its moral status. More trivially, our relevant celebration shouldn't be our birthday, but should be our conception day. What I'm trying to say is that when you think about how we actually deal with the human facts of reproduction, it becomes a bit unusual to think that conception is the starting point. It just doesn't make sense. Think also about miscarriages. Miscarriages can be very sad. They can be very sad events. I think many of those who try to get pregnant are deeply disappointed by the So, do we have an alarm going off in this building? No. Okay. So in miscarriages, it's a sad event when a couple that's trying to have a baby has a miscarriage. But at the same time, I think most of us think, particularly early in an early pregnancy, it's a bit of an overreaction to treat that as if your child had died. We think that somehow they're failing to recognize what reproduction is all about if they're treating, say, a miscarriage at, let's pick 8 weeks, the same as they treat the death of a 4-year-old. Maybe we're all just making a huge moral mistake. That's a possibility. But I wanted to sort of reflect on our actual practices to think about how our moral intuitions on this case speak to our understanding of what's morally at stake in reproduction. I want to suggest that if you think about this, you realize that in these sorts of cases, there's not really someone around yet who's got the same sort of moral status as you or me, even if there is something that might grow into something that has that status. And I think that that's why it would also be wrong to treat a spontaneous miscarriage lightly. I think it's wrong to mourn it the way you'd mourn a 4-year-old, but I think it would be wrong to treat it as just nothing, just a triviality. And why? It's because I think we think of people as one of a kind, as irreplaceable. When an egg is fertilized, there is a biological creature that's one of a kind. There won't be another one of those. And so the loss of that person, either spontaneously or, I'm going to argue, in an abortion, makes the world somewhat less. That's one thing that the world doesn't have anymore. In theology, this is called the sanctity of life. I happen not to be a religious person myself, so I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of putting it. But it's nonetheless recognizing something that I think is morally relevant here. Not a right to life, but rather the loss of something with intrinsic value, something that's irreplaceable, something that won't be around again. So what I want to argue for is a moderate view on the abortion debate. I don't want to say that moral standing starts from the moment of fertilization. I just think that gets the facts wrong. Nor do I want to wait until we have the infant around. I think that would be a bit bizarre too. So I want to say, well, let's think about what is actually going on in a pregnancy. So women carry the fetus for 9 months in a physically taxing process. Until recently, many women died in pregnancy. Both my sisters, in fact, would be dead from the first children, had there not been contemporary medicine on hand. Currently, there are 400 deaths of women per 100,000 live births in the world. That is the rate of 20 per 100,000 live births in the developed world, which is still pretty surprising when you think about it. 20 women out of 100,000 die in the course of carrying their child. 440 in the developing world. That's from the World Health Organization. Until abortion was widely available, many women would try to induce abortion themselves, and there'd be serious physical harm to themselves, including death. My father is a surgeon who's now in his 80s. He talks about what it was like when he was training in medicine, where you would go to wards, entire wards, where it'd be women who were either close to death or recovering from grave physical harm, having tried to cause an abortion in themselves. So I want to say that abortion, even if it's a bad thing, the loss of something irreplaceable, it might still, in some occasions, be better than the alternative, especially in the early stages of pregnancy. Most obviously, I think, when the woman's life would be lost were the pregnancy continued. In those cases in particular, it's very hard to see how abortion can't be justified. Or when the woman's health is going to be seriously threatened by her carrying the fetus to term. Or when she's going to be harmed otherwise. Perhaps even when that harm is a harm just to her psychological health. I make it sound just. Psychological distress is a serious thing. If the woman is not in a position to be able to handle psychologically carrying a child, this thing growing within her for 9 months, well then, perhaps an abortion in the early stages of it could be justified. Right? Remember how we think about early stage miscarriages. Remember how we think about those early stage fertilized eggs that the woman might not even know amount to a pregnancy yet. You might even want to go so far as to say that an abortion can be justified even when a woman's sense of what her life is all about is threatened. So she's not ready to be a mother yet. Yes, there's the loss of something irreplaceable. There'll never be that creature, that the fetus, there'll never be that human being that the fetus would have grown into. That's true. But sometimes we have to do decisions that have as outcomes unfortunate events. Later stage abortions are much, much more significant, much more difficult to justify. And I think many of them aren't justified myself. Just like we think that late pregnancy miscarriages, if you're at 7 months and you have a miscarriage, typically that's not a miscarriage, that's a very, a premature birth. 7 months actually would probably survive. Those, we often think, are the same as losing a family member. And so abortion in those late stages of pregnancy are indeed deeply morally challenging. So we have to ask the question, where should a line be drawn? When is an abortion okay and when it isn't? And I actually think we don't need to draw some general line. In the law, we do, but I'm not making a legal argument. I'm making a moral argument. And I think it's really going to depend on the situation. I don't think there's a straightforward answer about abortion, always right or always wrong. I think it's really going to depend on the situation. Even very late stage abortions can be justified in some cases, I think. When George Tiller, the Kansas abortion doctor, was killed a couple years ago, there was an interesting discussion in a blog connected with the Atlantic magazine. Andrew Sullivan started listing the stories of women who had had abortions through Dr. Tiller, very late abortions. He did abortions till a very late period. And they were talking about why they made that decision and how difficult it was. Or there were women who were talking about why they didn't abort a fetus in that kind of circumstances. Say anencephalic infants, where you discover through imaging that the fetus doesn't have a brain or something like that. These are really hard questions. I don't think I have a straightforward answer. I think we have to look at it in a great amount of detail. All this is to say, I don't think in morality there are simple answers, so I don't think in the morality of abortions there are simple answers. There's no straightforward yes, there's no straightforward no. I think it depends on the case. And to answer this, we'll be calling on our deepest values, each of us. And that's why I think, going back to the legal question, that's why I think when it comes to the legal question, I don't think it's the place of the government to legislate morality on this question. Instead, the government should let each of us decide for ourselves how we're going to deal with this deep and challenging personal question, especially at the beginning of pregnancy. As the fetus develops, As it becomes closer and closer to being an infant, to being a citizen under the law, well then the state's interest in that fetus becomes more and more pressing, and the state, I think, can start legitimately playing a role in restricting and controlling access to abortion. It doesn't mean you have to agree with anyone else's abortion decisions. You might think I'm a jerk when I think I'm just being sensible, for example, going back to the earlier example. Like so much in life, I think we have to learn to agree to disagree when it comes to the abortion debate, particularly when thinking about abortion as a moral question. Thanks.
So just to restate, this part of the debate will be rebuttal. There will be 10 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll move on to closing statements. So I'd like to call upon Stephanie Gray first to start off the first 10-minute rebuttal.
Well, first I'd like to begin by mentioning October 12th to you. The date, October 12th, may not seem significant, but it is to me because it was my conception day. And I am not joking when I say I celebrate my conception day. And perhaps I am the first person that Dr. AInslie has ever met who celebrates their conception day, but I'm not the only one. So does my staff. And we actually went to a restaurant to have a staff conception day lunch from my colleague Leah, and we told the waiter that instead of celebrating birthdays on staff, we celebrate conception days, and he brought us a free dessert. So, if life begins at fertilization, which we know scientifically it does, then yes, what that will reveal is that we may have inconsistencies as a society. We may not celebrate conception days as we should. But it doesn't mean we don't celebrate conception days because the preborn don't exist at fertilization or conception. We may likely not celebrate conception days because we don't know precisely when we were conceived. And by the way, I've estimated, not asked my parents. Although if this video goes on YouTube, that's going to be awkward. But anyways, we may not know the precise day. We may not want to figure out the precise day, but it doesn't mean we didn't exist. I'm going to come back to that, but I'm now going to start with some of the things that Dr. AInslie said in the beginning portion of his remarks. He even talked about how we start our lives in our mothers. Well, yes, we do, and that hasn't been refuted. The science hasn't been refuted. All he's pointing to is perhaps some inconsistencies in society, but made no proof to disprove what I've said and provide a more compelling case. He says that morals can be complex, or he said our considered moral opinion on a complex situation. I would say abortion is not complex in terms of determining whether it's right or wrong. The unplanned pregnancy may be complex from an emotional perspective, a social perspective, a financial perspective, but whether or not the act of abortion is an ethical or unethical solution to those complicated unplanned pregnancy situations, that isn't complicated. It's as simple as figuring out if the preborn are human and does abortion kill them. He talked about the woman's life being in danger and some people permitting abortion in those cases. I do not, because if the preborn are human, I cannot kill them to save someone else. In the same way, I cannot kill you to obtain your heart and your liver and your cornea to save a whole bunch of people who need those organs. It doesn't matter how good my end is, I can't kill you. But the fact that I can't kill you to help those people who need organ transplants doesn't mean I don't do anything. to help the person who needs an organ transplant. So it is possible to intervene in a life and danger situation with a pregnant woman and that intervention not be an abortion. So for example, if she has an ectopic pregnancy, likely the majority of those happen in the fallopian tube, so the fallopian tube's expanding will eventually burst. If it bursts, the woman can die and the baby will die. In that situation, there's a medical procedure called a salpingectomy, where that section of the fallopian tube is removed. That action isn't committed on the baby's body to end the child's life. It is committed on the woman's body to save her life. The fallopian tube is a non-essential part of her body, it's not needed for her survival, and if left alone would result in her demise. It is ethical to intervene by removing that body part. If we could then put the child somewhere and keep the baby alive, we would. With current technology, we can't. So the child's death is an effect of doing a good thing, which is addressing that pathological condition of the woman. So just because I don't allow abortion in such a situation doesn't mean I say let's step back and do nothing. There are in fact things that we can do. Dr. AInslie talked about, having an abortion at 8 months for a trip to Europe being morally repugnant. My question is why? If there's nothing wrong with abortion, if the preborn aren't human, it shouldn't bother us that women have them for vacations. And by the way, there's an abortionist in British Columbia who performed an abortion on a woman who felt her pregnancy interfered with her trip to Hawaii. It shouldn't bother us if there's nothing wrong with abortion. But if it bothers us because it kills an innocent human being to go on vacation, when do we ever say it's okay to directly and intentionally kill an innocent human being? Even that situation of rape that Dr. AInslie referred to, a horrible circumstance. No words to describe the injustice that has been committed on the rape victim. But is it ethical for us to end the life of an innocent human being because the father of that human being has committed a crime? He says, sometimes between the beginning and the end of pregnancy is when, we'd, maybe consider abortion to be immoral. Why between the beginning and the end? Doesn't it make sense to protect life when it begins? For if we do not protect it when it begins, wherever we protect it, what's our reason? And from fertilization to birth, the only reason can be one of those 4 criteria based on their development. Well, at this point, they're more developed, or maybe they'll feel pain, or whatever the case may be. But the same could be said after birth. Well, let's draw it at birth, or let's draw it at 3 months after birth, or let's draw it at 1 year after birth. Wherever we draw the line, we're drawing it based on development and how old you are. That's arbitrary, and it results in savage inequality. But your very identity and existence can be traced back to fertilization, and that's something Dr. AInslie has not refuted. Now, he provided a lot of statistics about miscarriages. The fact that some people die naturally does not mean we may kill them purposefully. I could give you statistics about high infant mortality in some third world countries compared to Canada. It doesn't mean those infants aren't human because they never make it to adulthood. In the same way, it doesn't mean the miscarried child isn't human because she never makes it to infancy. Those of us who live longer don't have a right to kill those who live shorter. He talks about, would women collect menstrual blood if there was, the possibility of miscarriage? Well, let me tell you, I had a friend that knew she was miscarrying, and she said to me, I am worried because I don't want to flush the blood, my baby, down the toilet. And I said, I share that same concern. I would collect it, and I would bury it. And she did. So if there is a likelihood, that you're miscarrying is the case of my friend, yes. You bury it like you would any child. Will you grieve? Yes, my friend did. Now, will she grieve as much or more than if she lost a child at the age of 10? Maybe, maybe not. But how much we grieve doesn't determine whether something is right or wrong. There are people dying in this city right now. Anyone crying? Doesn't mean if we're not having an emotional reaction that it's okay that they're dying or in fact being killed. Now, if you just got word that one of your relatives died, you may have that emotional reaction. That's not how we determine right or wrong, how we feel about something. The question is, bringing back to that UN document, all humans have the inherent right to life. Every member of the human family has the right to life. I'd also like to quote from the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. They say in that document, the child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection before as well as after birth. By virtue of the fact that they're needy, that they're immature, that they're vulnerable, that warrants giving them greater concern and protection. With regards to illegal abortion, that is a tragedy. I don't want abortions to happen legally or illegally. I don't want them to happen at all. But the law should reflect what's true and what's just and what's good. Dr. AInslie sort of talked about how we don't legislate morality, but we legislate morality all the time when we say rape is illegal, when we say killing infants is illegal. So if we'll legislate morality about rape and infanticide, why won't we also legislate morality about the preborn? The fact that someone gets hurt or killed in the process of killing another doesn't mean we make it legal for them to commit that behavior. If a man hurts his hands when he beats his wife, we don't give him boxing gloves to keep himself safe the next time he hurts her. Because what brings about his harm is the infliction of harm on another. In the same way, we can't legalize the killing of one's offspring in utero, even if doing that brings about one's harm, if what we're doing is killing an innocent human being. So you see, it keeps coming back to, are the preborn innocent human beings? I'm out of time. Thank you.
Let's call on Donald AInslie for the last 10 minutes of rebuttal before we move on to closing statements. Thank you.
There was a lot going on there, so I'm not sure how I'm going to address it all. I think I want to start at the point of Stephanie and I think, agree that preventing a life from coming into being through contraception, morally innocuous. I'm not sure if you agree with that. At the end of a pregnancy, an infant, something has full moral status. The question is, where does that moral status start? And Stephanie wants to say at the very beginning, and I want to say sometime in the middle. And I'm not going to be very precise about that. I do think there is a kind of moral status that a fetus has. Let's use fetus generically to mean any time in this 9-month process. That's not the scientific term, but that's what I'm going to use. I think there's a sense in which there is something morally significant there right from the very beginning. As I said, the loss of that creature will be the loss of something irreplaceable. And that's why abortion is always a morally significant decision. Stephanie suggests that it should be so significant it's the same as killing you or me. And that's where I disagree. And so I tried to use some examples to motivate the intuitions to help you see that that's not what you think either. So I wanted to emphasize just how much happens between that beginning and this endpoint. So that's why I was talking about our moral intuitions about, say, the unimplanted fertilized eggs, 40 to 60% of them. If there's a person like you or me on hand when you have a fertilized egg, well then any sexually active woman has to take her period very seriously indeed, because her contraception might have failed, or she might not have been using it, and she might be pregnant in the sense of there might be a fertilized egg in the offing, and it might just be being expelled from her body along with her period. That happens lots of times. So I wanted us to think about that, to just think about how I wanted our emotional reactions to guide us to understand what we think about the beginning of life from a moral point of view. So we can say both that there's something morally significant if it developed into an infant, there'd be a person like you or me. Yes, we all started that way. I don't deny that.